Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Rhiannon Gamble, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections and actions. Together we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators Program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the Global South, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators Program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi, it's Morag Gamble from our Permaculture Life and the Permaculture Education Institute, and it's my great pleasure to be here today with Rob Hopkins.
Hello.
In Totnes, actually.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's been about 20 years since I was here.
Okay.
I don't think Transition Town Totnes was happening back then.
No, it didn't exist. No, it's been about 12 years.
Yeah. So the focus that I have in the work that I do and all the materials that I create is around permaculture, and I know that that's kind of where you started with the whole Transition Town. So could you take us just back in
Tell you my
history?
permaculture story.
Yeah, maybe that would be a good place to start.
Okay, so when I was about 22, 23 or something like that, I went travelling in India and Pakistan and China and travelled up through the Karakoram mountains and was travelling with a guy called Chris, who was from Mullaney and who lived at Crystal Waters Permaculture Village.
Really? That's where I'm...
Chris Gwynn.
Chris? No way.
Yeah.
You're kidding me, really?
No, I was travelling with Chris, yeah. Because Chris is Buddhist and we both met in Dharamsala.
He's my neighbour.
Okay. It's a small world.
It's a small world.
So Chris and I and somebody else, got a guy called Dave, so we travelled through up through Pakistan. Yeah. And Chris at the time was writing, he would send little sort of like little mini articles back for his local permaculture magazine or something like that. And every time we arrived anywhere with apricot trees, he got very excited and started writing these things. And he kept talking about permaculture this and permaculture that. I had no idea what he was talking about. And we went to the Hunza Valley, which I now recognise as being one of the great original permacultures. And he was like beside himself with permaculture fervour and dashing about writing off these articles about how amazing it all was. And because I didn't know what permaculture was, but I remember it had a real impact on me, that place. I'd never been anywhere that felt so kind of content or sort of resilient, and sort of there was something really extraordinary about it that had a real impression on me.
I think a similar experience I had was spending time up in Ladakh.
I'm sure.
So I went up there in about 1992 and spending almost a year over a period of 2 years there, and it had a similar impact on me. Oh, this is what it means to live well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's content. People are content and simple. It's natural materials, natural food, great community, excellent music, lots of fun. And I just went, what are we doing?
We should do it like that. So then when I travelled with Chris, he kept talking about permaculture. I had no idea what he was talking about. Then when I got back to England, a friend of mine gave me a copy of the designer's manual. Just like, oh, Rob, you might enjoy this. Like a big thing. Like a really nice present. So you might enjoy this. So, and it completely blew me away. It was like that concept of earth repair. I was like, wow, someone's written a book about earth repair. That's just amazing. So then I found there was a permaculture group in Bristol, and I kind of harassed them until they organised a design course. And then I did the design course, which kind of rewired my brain, really. And then Can
we just stop there for a minute? Like when you say rewind your brain, I hear a lot of people saying that. What is it about permaculture courses that you think helps to rewire people's brains? What is it that shifts?
Well, the way I talk about it is in the Transition Handbook, I wrote about it as being like a really awful B movie I saw called They Live. Have you ever seen a film called They Live? It's hilarious, and it's. But the beginning of it is beautiful. It's this guy going down this alleyway, and he finds this box full of sunglasses, and he takes out these sunglasses and he kind of puts them on. And when he puts them on, he can see the world in a completely different way. So he can see that actually half the people are aliens, and all the adverts that say things like, get shinier hair with whatever, say consume and die, and he's like, oh, and he puts them on and off, and it's like, for me it was like that. It was like it gave me my kind of possibilities glasses of looking at things in a very different way, and looking at spaces and thinking, actually, it doesn't have to be like that. It could be like this. And it gave me the tools to be able to think, well, what it could be like. I think that was, and it rewires your brain to think in systems and connection rather than isolating things down, which is very much the culture we grew up in, I think. So then I did a degree that was the first sort of sustainability degree at the time, which thank God I did a permaculture course first, because otherwise I think I would have jumped off a bridge halfway through. But actually, I meet some of the tutors occasionally, and they say it was so great because we learned loads from the fact I'd be going, what about reed beds? What about whatever, And then we moved to Ireland and basically spent 10 years just trying stuff out. So we did a kind of eco-village project and built cob houses. And at the Kinsale College, I started the first 2-year full-time permaculture course.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Which was amazing. And it's only really coming here I really see how amazing it was. That actually there is this little fertile edge in the Irish education system with this very visionary principal who I went to and said, I've got this idea, John, for this course. I had a friend of mine who already taught drama there, and I said, I've got this idea for a course, and he said, oh, what would that be? And I said, would permaculture be like this? And he'd never heard of permaculture before. He said, yeah. How many people do you think would want to do it? And I said, well, how many do you need? He said, well, if you had 15, we could run it the first year. So the first year we had 24, and then every year after that we had 40, and we could have filled it twice.
Wow.
And we built forest gardens and gardens. And then the last year I was there, we built a whole theatre out of all materials from within 5 miles of the town: cob, cordwood, roundwood, poles, plasters. It was fantastic.
So why do you think people are attracted to do it at 2-year course in permaculture in Ireland? Because I know in Australia, people would love to do it, but they get to the point of thinking, well, if I spent 2 years doing this, what kind of work can I create in? What's the job? There's no kind of job called that. And people get stuck on that, I think, and it's always still stayed in that kind of the hobby realm. You actually get people to spend 2 years to do it. That's a significant
commitment.
thing.
Well, it was a 1-year course, and then in the last year I was there, we added a second year on because a lot of people just really liked that. They were like, "Can we do some more, please?" So the heart of it was a 1-year course that was like an expanded design course with loads of practical stuff. Where did people do it? I think it was in Ireland. You could do a course like that for free because of adult education, and it was great. And I had the opportunity to design the permaculture course I would have really liked to do, and we went to see loads of great projects and loads of trips, but I don't know what.
Do you know what people started to do after they did that course? Did they go out and create enterprises or just transform their places?
I think at the time, I don't think there was a particular. I think that kind of emphasis that says, okay, how can we create enterprises and livelihoods out of this wasn't such a big part of it. And actually now, certainly with the transition movement, we kind of brought that in a lot more strongly, I think. But at the time, there are some people who went off and did, who went off and maybe started natural building companies or gardeners. Quite a lot of people then have actually settled around Kinsale and have started interesting businesses. So there's some good kind of CSAs and vegetable grow production stuff. So it's like it's a bit like with Totnes, where you've had Dartington Art College for years, and so there's loads of people stay, and then you've got a much more creative town.
Seeds a new culture.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is what transition's all about, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So how did you transition from that
to
where you are now?
So I was teaching permaculture, and permaculture was my main sort of everything, I suppose. And then in 2004, so we were doing an eco-village project with another family, and we were the first 2 houses were being built. We were building cob houses, the first new cob houses built for 100 years or something in Ireland. And
really? That's quite significant.
Yeah. And there was loads of volunteers and woofers, and people helped out in building them. And so our house was about 6 months off being finished, and then around that October, I had all sort of different things happen at once. So I had my I can't remember what it was that triggered it. I had my sort of climate change, sort of dark night of the soul. I was like, was really thinking, wow, okay. And then someone burnt our house down. We had an arson attack on this house that we'd spent 2 years building, which was the most beautiful thing. It was really, really traumatic sort of period of time. So, and then also I was reading David Holmgren's book came out, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. Yes. So I had a friend who was living with us at the time, and we were both reading it, and then we'd meet up for breakfast every morning and discuss every chapter. And that sort of blew my mind, that book, because it really sort of put permaculture right, but it sort of felt like it sort of drifted off, and he put it right back in the middle and said, no, this is the design system for the energy crisis and the climate crisis. And it was so skillful and rich, and I always say it's like the most delicious chocolate cake you've ever had. You can't just eat it all in one go. You have to have really thin little slices and go and lie down in a dark room between each one and digest it.
It's a bit like the original, the permaculture designers manual. You can't just sit down and read that either.
No.
Or Retro Suburbia, for that matter, which has come out recently.
Well, if you can lift that off the table without giving yourself a hernia. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally. I don't know what you're saying about it.
So we had this period of 8 months of thinking, well, now what do we do? And so I had that year's course still to teach. So all of that sort of chaos in October over the year was sort of digested and turned into a project that I gave the second year students, which was to say, okay, your main project for the rest of this year is, if the town of Kinsale were to, over 20 years, make the journey from where it is now, completely oil dependent for everything, to a place where that wasn't the case anymore, how would it do that? How would you tell that story? What would it look like? And can we design what that would look like year by year? So I gave different combinations of students, right? You three, you're doing food. You guys are doing tourism. You guys are doing education. You guys are doing whatever. And, and to see this as an enormous opportunity. So they went off and then they do these projects. And over the year, we went to see interesting things and researched lots of stuff. And so at the end, they all handed in their assignments at the end of the year, which were this kind of timetable, like telling the story. And I had all these things and I marked them all and did all that teacher stuff. And I thought, actually, this is amazing. I'd never seen anything like this before. So I wrote like a foreword introducing the project and I produced it. So put them all together. So they were like a little book. And then I used the last bit of my budget and just printed 500 copies of this thing. So the last thing I did before I left Ireland and came here was we organised a conference called Fueling the Future. That was a kind of peak oil climate conference. And Richard Heinberg came as one of the speakers. Yep. And we had this thing that we'd made and we had these copies and we didn't formally launch it or anything. We just had them almost apologetically on for sale at the back of the hall. The Kinsale Energy Descent Action Plan, we called it. And it was on the table at the back of the hall. And I gave Richard a copy and he took it away to where he was staying. He came back the next morning and he said, that is amazing. That is the missing piece that we've all been waiting for. That is absolutely brilliant. And he took a whole load of copies with him back to America. He wrote about it. We put it online. Someone in Australia ordered 100 copies.
Yeah, well, it was really, particularly around the Sunshine Coast area. I don't know if Janet Millington and the whole Sunshine Coast transition town movement was massive. And through our councils and everything.
I know. So that's 100 went off in a box to Australia. Yeah. And then we put it online. It was downloaded thousands of times. So then we moved here in 2005, kind of with nothing really, but thinking, there was something in that project that was really interesting. And then some of the students who were in Kinsale stayed on in Kinsale, and they came up with this term Transition Town to carry on, which was basically, it was a name that referred to them trying to make that energy descent plan a reality. And they took it to the town council who said, we endorse this and we'll give you €5,000 to do something with it. So then things just started taking off here, really.
That's brilliant. Gosh. And so now you're in Totnes and you've been here for quite some time. And Totnes was already quite an interesting town already. So maybe receptive ground for some change. I'd be interested to hear how you've seen towns that are, because I come from a Laney area, and so similarly we have this kind of receptive ground for new ideas. So if you were to go into a town, or there's a few people in a town where there's not much happening already, how have you seen Transition Town kind of emerge in those different contexts? Because I'm asking this question because I was just talking into the Beyond Development course up at Schumacher College, and the students were exploring all these different ideas. They said, that's really great. I love it. I'd love to see it. But I can just see in my town, I don't even know where to start. I can't even imagine where I can begin with this. And so I guess I'm kind of bringing that question to this conversation to sort of think about, if it's you're starting from the very start, what are some of the things that kind of spark the imagination of that community or the interest in starting on this journey?
So I think that one of the important things about Totnes is it's a place that has a long history of being a sort of creative, sort of different place. And a friend of mine did a PhD a while ago that said, well, why is that? And it's kind of various things in the town's history. But one of the things he pointed out was that he said across the UK there are 6 or 7 what he called laboratory towns. So Hebden Bridge, Stroud, Lewis, Totnes, places like that, which have a history of attracting maybe a higher number of sort of culturally creative people and being quite tolerant and far enough away from London to develop their own kind of identity. And they're places where people try stuff out, like Mullaney, and if they don't work, then it's just another mad idea from Mullaney. But sometimes those ideas do take off, and then they spread everywhere. So the first vegetable box scheme in the UK came from here. The first LET scheme was here. The first transition project was here. So I like to think of us as the sort of Silicon Valley of resilience.
That's wonderful.
But with better coffee. So I've forgotten what your question was.
My question was really about
other towns. How you get started. So there's a list somewhere of sort of places that became transition towns and the order they did it. So the first 10 or 15 were the kind of places you'd expect, Totnes, Brixton, Stroud, whatever. Yeah. And then it kind of carried on spreading out into all kinds of different places. And actually, there's lots of places where it has happened that you really wouldn't think would be that kind of place. And I think, now we always say that transition is an experiment, and it's been a 12-year experiment, and we run on a spirit of we don't know how to do it, but if enough people have a go, maybe together we can figure it out.
So have you had any, when it all started back in Kinsale, you probably had no idea.
No, not at all.
So how does that feel?
Not at all.
What do you think were kind of the key things that have sparked people's interest in it so much that it's just become this global phenomenon, really?
Yeah, sometimes people imagine that it was like we sort of plotted it like some sort of, Uber startup or something. Initially the idea here was, could we come up with something that might work here in this town? That was the motivation. And then even when we had the launch event here in 2006 in September, there were people who turned up here from like Falmouth and London and all sorts of places, and it's like, it's only how have they even heard about it? Because all there was at the time was a little blog that I was doing called Transition Culture, and it's amazing.
So it's like such extraordinary, so appealing to people.
I think
I feel it, but I'm interested to know what you think.
Yeah, I think it was something that was really timely, because at the time there were lots of people who were really waking up to what was happening in terms of climate change and all the various other things, and that a lot of the responses that were out there were very fear-based responses. What do? We go up into the mountains with 4 years worth of baked beans and toilet paper and firearms, and somehow that's the solution. And I think because transition said, no, we figure this out where we are with the people around us, and we figure this out by rebuilding social connections, and we figure this out by coming together rather than going further apart, and with a model which is a compassionate response to this crisis. And which has a degree of humility built into it from the beginning, that says we don't have all the solutions, but maybe we can figure it out together. We kind of designed Transition Network from the outset to be very, to enable self-organizing, to have a very loose set of principles and values that people felt they could identify with and sit within. It wasn't onerous to become a transition town. It was quite light touch, but you felt part of a network. And we always said to people, all the stuff is free. It's free. You don't have to pay a membership fee. The only condition is you share your stories. So it became like a network of storytelling and exchange. And I always often tell the story about how about 8 years ago, I got invited up to London by this organisation that supports social entrepreneurs. They rang me up and said, you are a social entrepreneur. Oh, thank you very much. And the idea was that you would go and you would pitch whatever your thing was to them, and if they liked it, then they would support you with different ways. So I went and I presented about transition for 15 minutes, and then there was this long silence in this room with this long glass table and metal chairs, and all these guys in shirts are looking at me like a long silence. This guy said, so what you've done basically is create a very powerful brand and then give it away for free to people all over the world over whom you have no control whatsoever. I said,
yes, exactly.
Absolutely, that's absolutely what we've done. He could not get it at all. He was like, what's your franchise model? Where's the leverage, whatever.
Does it fit?
Yeah, he could not get his head around it at all. So I think it's because there was something that was, I think people were really hungry for something that said, no, we can do this, and we can do this at the neighbourhood scale. We can do it at whatever level feels possible for us. It should feel fun. I think that there was a degree of playfulness and celebration that transition brought in that people really valued. But also, I would never also underestimate the amount of hard work that went into it from a lot of people who were working in transition at the time. So all the travelling and the speaking and the blogging and the films that we made and all of that stuff. It's like it didn't emerge completely effortlessly. There was a huge amount of skill. And also I think one of the other reasons that that it did, that it took off very quickly, was that from the beginning, it also had that kind of inner and outer side of it, to say, this is not purely about solar panels and carrots. There is also how we do things matters as much as what we do, and how we do the meetings and make decisions and run events and all of it. Having a mindfulness to minimizing burnout and all of that stuff was a really skillful addition, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess echoing what you're saying, I think the thing about there's some very big issues that we're facing. It's like you're saying, that the dark moment, facing up to where we're at, that a lot of what we get in media is that it's such a big problem and we need big solutions. And all of a sudden, something like Transition Town comes across, the transition movement, and it's something that I can do that has meaning and purpose, and it's actually making a positive contribution, and I can see that I can bring my family and my community along on this journey as well, and it personalizes and brings it back down to here and now. And sometimes that gets belittled, the idea of we need big picture activism, we need big solutions, whereas actually it's this multitude of small scale, positivity and like you said, possibilities, seeing the possibilities, which I guess is where you're kind of moving now. I can see you've just released a book, have you?
No, it'll be out in September, October.
That's recently, almost released a book. On imagination.
On imagination.
Which is exactly what you're talking about there. It's that the ability, I suppose, to see the possibilities and to imagine a different future. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I found myself reading more and more people who I really admire, like George Monbiot and Naomi Klein, who kept saying, climate change is a failure of imagination. And then they'd move off onto something else. And I'd be like, hang on, that was really interesting, that bit. What do you mean? It's a failure of why are we having a failure of the imagination? And then I read this amazing research by a researcher in America who looked at this thing called the Torrance test for creative thinking, which is the sort of gold standard creativity test going back to the 1960s. Massive data sets in the US. And her conclusion was, and it came out in 2011, this research, that IQ and imagination rose together till the mid-90s, and then IQ kept rising and imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline. And when it was published, it was on the front page of Newsweek. It was a big thing in America. What does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood? I've never heard anyone in the climate change social justice world say, well, what does this mean for us, actually? Because if people can't imagine anything other than what's in front of us, then we're toast. Margaret Thatcher very powerfully said there is no alternative, and I think those words lodged themselves in our culture, that this is it, this is all there is, there's nothing else. And so it set me off thinking, well, are we living in a time of imaginative poverty? Why would that be? The woman who wrote that report said it was to do with the decline of what she called free and unstructured play. It was to do with the rise of screens, and it was to do with the rise of testing in schools. So that was my starting point. I think it's also to do with we spend a lot less time outdoors in nature. And the stuff about screens is something which, is the more you look into that, the more troubling it is, the impact that's having.
Maybe also with that too, because of all those things, a lot less time together in conversation.
Totally.
Through those conversations, then, our imaginations.
Absolutely. We're living in a time of the decline of conversation. There's a guy called Sven Birkitz, who I adore, who wrote some great books about attention. What happens to a culture when it loses its attention span? And he said, I fear we are losing the very paradigm of depth in our culture, because it becomes shallower and shallower and shallower. So I've done a lot of looking at, what are the reasons why this might be happening, and then what would it look like? How do you turn that around? As a community, how do you bring imagination back? If you were running a country, how would you bring about a kind of a revival of imagination? Yeah, exactly. Like, how would you create a national imagination act? To say we're going to put the reviving of this country's imagination above everything else. What would an education system look like if people left at 18 with their imaginations like a superpower? How would all of that work? So that's coming out soon.
So I'd like to kind of continue on that thought of the education, because one of the main things that I'm working on is creating a platform for permaculture educators, and so I'm really interested to hear your insights on where you think maybe we could be working better as permaculture educators, or as educators in general. I try and homeschool my kids as much as I can, and this whole idea about shifting the way that we focus on education. or shifting our focus in education to lifting, unshackling the boundaries and lifting the ceilings and focusing on the curiosities that emerge as we're working with people. So, what are your kind of takes on education through this perspective?
Well, I was in Belgium last week, and I gave a talk in a university there, and there was a woman who said, in the questions, she said, I teach in the engineering department. How could we do what we do so we're more of service to what you're talking about? And I said, get the engineering department, ideally the whole university, to declare a climate emergency. We're seeing the rise of Extinction Rebellion, and their big thing is we want to get the governments to declare a climate emergency. And there's now all sorts of different local district councils who are declaring a climate emergency because of XR.
Ours as well.
Okay, so then when you declare a climate emergency, then they do that, and then they go,
yeah. Exactly.
Well, now what do we do? We've done that bit. We have no idea what to do next. And I said to this woman, imagine if you were teaching a 3-year engineering degree through the lens of a climate emergency. How differently would you teach it? I think it would be the most amazing engineering course. Imagine you're like, okay, so you're teaching with that sense of, like the guys who developed the Spitfire in the 3 years before World War II. From nothing, they designed and built this plane that was unable to. So you're working with people like that. And what would an English literature degree look like in the context of a climate emergency? If a school declares a climate emergency, then you look at everything through that lens. I visited a school when I went to Germany a couple of years ago, who had created a wildlife garden next to the school. They bought this little bit of a paddock, and it had a pond and all sorts of like wildlife stuff. It was great, and the kids loved it. And I spoke to the head teacher, and I said, how do you make use of it? She said, well, when we do maths and we want to work out the radius and circumference, we send them out to measure a tree. If they want to write an essay and they want some focus, they go out and they go out in the garden. Actually, they use the garden as a teaching resource for everything. So if you have a school that says we declare a climate emergency, then you bring in the permaculture teachers to teach the kids, and through that you teach them maths, and through that you teach them English, and through that you teach them biology, and actually you're still teaching them the same stuff, but it's more applied. One of the things that I was looking at when I was researching this book, because it's kind of so outside of my generation's experience, is what would it look like to live in a time when imagination ran free, when we lived in a time when everything felt possible, and our imaginations were like, and we could just say, yeah, that's no problem, we could do that, we can tackle that, and looking back, well, where are there times in history when it felt like the imagination was really free? And the most recent one was a month before I was born in Paris, in like the 1968 student revolution in Paris in 1968, which was all rooted in art and imagination and music. And a lot of the graffiti at the time was all about power to the imagination, imagination taking power, be realistic, demand the impossible, all that. And there was some beautiful oral history stuff I found about people talking about it. And one person said, in those 2 months, you learn more than in the whole of your 5 years in university, because people talk to each other. Anyone felt they could go up and talk to anyone, and talk to your neighbour was graffiti that people wrote on the walls.
I think too that it's having a context for learning, because often when I spend a lot of time working in different sort of universities, and I take permaculture into this university or something, and they come up after and say, that was amazing, because it was that possibility. They say, mostly we're just kind of learning bits and pieces, and it's all just parts. It's not the connections. It doesn't have that bigger picture. So if you do place education in the context, like you're saying, in the context of imagine, you're teaching this from a perspective of climate emergency, all of a sudden, everything you start to do is about a bigger picture rather than just getting through year by year to get your marks, to get your job. And I think that's where a lot of people feel stuck. Most of the young people I talk to at the moment they're just doing it just because, but have no real. And even at school, my middle son actually just went back to school last year. He wanted to go to do leadership in grade 6.
Okay.
Very quickly, he got incredibly bored and just said, "I have all these questions, and they just keep telling me to put my hand down. It's not the time to talk. It's not the time to talk." And so he's coming back out again. We can have lots of great conversations. But that learning in context, and it doesn't matter what the what it is that you're focusing on. Having the bigger picture and the purpose seems to make all the sense, every single piece of sense that I can imagine. And so how are you going to take that forward? Because that sounds phenomenal.
Yeah.
What's your next step with that?
Well, my next step is I've got to finish this book off, first of all. I mean, I love the story that I came across researching the book about the Reggio Emilia schools in Italy.
Yeah.
So like after the war, when this town, all they had left was a tank and 3 trucks and 6 horses, the Germans left. And then they used the money to build the school and it was built around this idea of how do you build an education system to make sure fascism never happens again.
Wow.
And so it's all about, seeing the children as being curious, creative, courageous, and the authors of their own learning. And every school has what they call an atelier in the heart of it, a maker space, where there's someone there to help you make anything whenever you want to. And it strikes me as interesting that, these people designed a school specifically with that intention around fascism. And now we have an education system that's completely opposite to that. And we're seeing the resurgence of fascism, it feels like it's pretty obvious how you educate people if you want them to be imaginative people, and we're doing completely the opposite. It's all about driven by tests. So their thing is about you don't learn by subject, you learn by project, and there is a lot of pressure in the UK so the youth strikes for climate, which I just think are amazing, and one of their demands is teach us properly about this stuff. And I think there's maybe one of the things we need to look at next is about how do we create that something that could just slot into the curriculum.
Which I was just about to ask you about, because I think that movement that's happening now with all those young people, I kind of feel a sense of connection with weather. I mean, I was born probably about the similar year as you, and I remember going through a whole series of to a series of rallies, peace rallies. There was sort of Chernobyl was happening. There was
South Africa.
There was so much
Iraq
happening.
War.
As a young teenager, there was a sense of purpose.
Yeah, totally.
Of being connected to a people around the world saying, we need something different.
Yeah.
And this is not what we want. And let's kind of come together around that. And then everything went quiet for a really long time. I don't feel like there's been much happening in the streets. Well, there hasn't been anyway in Australia. And all of a sudden, this has taken off, and it's phenomenal.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. Yeah.
And so what was that, 15th of March, there was 1.5 million students on the streets, and I'm sure there's many more in their heart marching as well. And after all that marching, then going to uni, I got this, I went into a dark place of thinking, oh gosh, that's what life's about now. It took me quite a while to actually discover how I could make a contribution. It was ending up, through Ladakh and finding permaculture that, okay. So I'm kind of thinking, how can we take permaculture and all the thinking that you're talking about directly to these students? And maybe it's not through the schools, maybe it's through something that's around.
Maybe.
I don't know. How can it be shared with them in a way that's...
Yeah, it's a tricky, isn't it? Because actually I feel like, so one of my kids in particular is very involved with the ones around here, and I find them really moving to go on. It feels to me like I get this feeling of like the reinforcements have arrived, and I love Greta Thunberg, who's kind of inspired. I love when the Australian education minister said, you should be in school, and she said, you should be in a museum.
She's got no fear.
She's so sassy.
I know.
Like, you should be in a museum, mate. You're a dinosaur. What are you talking about? So there's a kind of a balance for me about actually it's their revolution, it's their thing. And so on the one hand, I feel like I don't want to be in there going, you guys all need to be doing permaculture courses, but on the other hand, I'm like, I really worry that they'll do it for a year and nothing will change, and they'll all just drift off and be really cynical.
I guess that's the cynicism, the disillusionment that comes out of being part of something big, and then not having something tangible to show
as a result of it. So
okay, well, we have all this passion and this commitment to say this is what we don't want, or we want this to stop. But that the story and the image and the vision of what's possible and what's next and the other potential futures. I'm not sure how to do it. That's why I'm kind of asking you, because what do you think about it as well? But I've been spending a lot of time chatting with the young people in and around our area.
Yeah.
And it's starting to become a really nice connection that's happening. But again, the same thing, I heard at the National Sustainable Living Festival in Melbourne, there was some of the key leaders in Australia there, and they made it really clear, like, this is our movement.
Yeah.
Don't come and take over and don't tell us what to do.
Totally.
Be there to support us. And so, but I'd like to sort of be there, sort of hands and arms open, saying, if you'd like, this is
permaculture.
So what could be a way to make it visible, I suppose, as an option?
So there was I taught a session at Schumacher College a while ago about, it was the first time I taught the full, like what's in this new book I've been doing, and I did a session with them all day, and then about 4 days later was the first student march in Exeter. So I'm at the student march. I went with my son just to support him and to be there, because I really wanted to be there. It felt like a historical thing. So there was about 800 kids outside the county council offices making a load of noise, and really great banners, really humorous and fun and wonderful. And then after about an hour, they all kind of looked round, and coming over the park towards them was another 400, like another great big group of kids who'd marched up from the university and picked up all the stragglers as they sort of came up, and marching with this big School Strikes for Climate banner at the front. And there was this really magical moment where the two groups kind of merged into each other and sort of cheered each other together. And then as I looked at the back, coming up at the back, there was a massive banner that just said, "What if?" on it. And it was the students who'd been in the session I taught. So this book I'm writing is called From What Is to What If. And so there was this banner that just said "What If" on it. And I was like, and it gave me goosebumps. and then when they arrived, they did this thing where they had all these cards that just said "What If" on. And then they just asked kids to just fill them out.
I saw those up at Schumacher. I saw them up on the wall.
Yeah, really good the stuff that was on there. And they got kids printing T-shirts with "What If" written on them and stuff, and asking them about that, And I think it felt like a fascinating sort of element that was added into everything. I guess. I mean, it feels like they're all kind of really open to ideas. Maybe the thing is just to set things up there, or just to be there. I don't know.
No, I don't know either.
But it would be really, really sad if it went the way of Occupy and those things that come up like a big souffle and then go down again. It was like what we really tried to do with transition was, whoa, there's a souffle, quick, how do we put props in underneath the souffle and then pump it up a bit more? So actually, it's the fact that transition still exists after 12 years feels amazing to me, because so many things like Occupy just come and go and come and go.
But it's interesting though, within the transition movement, there's the movement as a whole is still there, but things within it can come and go, which is perfect as well. And it's a little bit like the Totnes Pound. That is an event tonight happening, isn't there? Which is there's a. Can you tell us a little bit about the rise and the? Yeah,
there's a little historical moment you're here for tonight. So I've got it here actually. So 12 years ago, I walked into a building on the high street and saw this, which is a banknote from 1810 when there was a Bank of Totnes that printed its own money. And I saw this and I thought, wow, that's so interesting. Maybe we could make some more. What would happen? Would the Queen come round and smash my windows? And so we just did it to see. We printed 300. That on one side was a facsimile of this, and on the other side said, these are the 18 shops you can spend them in. Let's see what happens. And then that went really well. So then we did another £1 note, and then another different £1 note. And then after a while, we did a 1, 5, 10 and a £21 note.
Can you just tell us about the £21 note? Because that's a fascinating thing.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't it was an idea we nicked off Lewis, actually. So Transition Town Lewis, the Lewis pound, they did a £21 note. And I thought, that is so cool. And it was something to do with like old English money, which I don't understand at all. It's like, 18 groats makes a spigot, and 15 shillings makes a twong or something, But there was a thing called a guinea that was 21 something, 21 pounds or 21 shillings or something nonsense like that. And so we thought, so that was where they came from with it. But here we did a £21 note, partly because we just thought, well, why not? Actually, you can do whatever denomination. Why should we be tied to the same denominations as other money? But also because we did a thing called the economic blueprint, local economic blueprint in Totnes. So we mapped the economy in Totnes and said, how much money do we spend on food, energy and care every year, and where does it go? And we found, for example, that we spend £30 million on food every year, of which 22 million at that time was spent in 2 supermarkets.
Yes.
So it meant that we could say that if we could make a 10% shift collectively away from shopping there to supporting our local businesses, that would be £2 million in the economy every year. And so if it was a 10% shift, if we made £21 notes and we sold them for £20, that was the 5%. So it was like saying to people, we'll give you the first 5% and you do the other 5. So for the first 6 months or something, we sold £21 notes for £20. That was the idea. But then also, I like, people say, why do you have a £21 note? We say, well, why not?
Yes.
You do what you like.
Yes.
But then, so we did it. So then we tried to have an electronic pound, like they have in Bristol and other places, but we're just too small to get a critical mass for that. And this is a town of 9,000 people. So what we found was over the last 3 or 4 years, because people use cash less and less, that the amount of trade was sort of dwindling to a point where we thought we could just let it just sort of limber along and just sort of peter out, or we could just say, okay, we'll just stop it and have a big celebration and celebrate what it was and how the influence it's had on other people. And
so what are the key things that you think that it helped to shift in people's mind?
Well, it's funny. I think, it's like we can... so when you wrap up a project like that, there's a part of you that thinks, oh, so it's a failure. Like in our culture, you think, oh, well, we did this, but it's failed because it's not become the currency of choice of everybody in Totnes. So, the way I think of it is, if you look at it as we wanted this to become the economic means of exchange for everybody in Totnes, then it failed. If you wanted to look at it as something that put Totnes on the map as a place that does unique and quirky things and tries out brave ideas, then I think most people, if they know nothing about Totnes, they know that it has had its own pound. If you want to look at it as an art project, where we printed beautiful things and got people involved in a big participatory community arts project, I think it's been absolutely extraordinary. If you want to look at it as a project that was about getting people thinking about why the local economy matters and why we should support it, then I think it was really successful. And if you want to look at it as being an imagination project that was about getting people thinking about possibilities in different ways, and it gave people the opportunity, people who visited Totnes, the opportunity to experience living as though there was another means of exchange, then it was a real success. And also, I think if you want to see it as being a way of challenging the epidemic of loneliness that we have at the moment. There's beautiful research done in Bristol which showed that when people went shopping with Bristol pounds, paper pounds, they had so many more conversations than when you went shopping with plastic. And so my experience as somebody who did a lot of my shopping in Totnes pounds was, it was so much more of a conversation piece. And I had so much more interaction with other people. You get them out. Oh, interesting. Oh, I love it when people shop with. And that experience of beautiful coloured notes that tell our story and our history and celebrate the people we celebrate. And for me, it's been kind of a magical thing, really. And also it's inspired so many other people. There's a lovely quote that I'll use tonight, which Thomas Edison said. I had to make 10,000 light bulbs before I made the first light bulb that was commercially viable. Does that mean that all the 9,999 early light bulbs I made were failures? No, they were all successes because they all helped me to realize what didn't work and got me to this point here. If you're a sculptor and you're making a statue, is the last hit of the hammer the successful one? Yeah. Of course, it's all. So for me, this was one manifestation that's inspired people all around the world to take the idea and create their own versions.
You were saying earlier that there's an enormous amount of local currencies around all throughout Europe now.
Yeah, everywhere I go, there's particularly in the French-speaking world, after that film Demain, in which I hold a 21 pound and say, well, why not? Or something. Actually, a lot of people came out of the cinema and what can we do? Let's do that. So I go to places where they have a 2.5 notes, or there's a currency launching that has 1, 3, 10 and 30 as their denominations, or in Brussels and in Liège, they have a 0 note.
That's amazing.
And I say, why have you got a zero note? And they say, well, because sometimes someone does something nice for you, you want to say thank you, but you don't want to put an amount on it because that feels a bit mercenary, but you just want to say thank you. It's like a token of gratitude, and then say, pass it on to somebody else, So and I love that kind of, again, it's that if we're looking at these things as being an opportunity for creativity and playfulness and conversation and connection, then I love that. Who else is going to start a currency with a 0 note and a 13 note?
That's such a fantastic thing. I'm looking forward to tonight's event. But before we close out tonight, I wish I did have a 0 note to give to you to thank you guys. Any last thoughts about, for people just entering into the world of becoming permaculture teachers? They're making the shift in their life to move from one to the other, and what are some of the things that you think would be... So these are people who are working either with children or in community education particularly.
Okay. I think my main thinking is, in the same way that we are saying to local governments and businesses and education establishments, you need to declare a climate emergency. I think it's kind of a question for us as well. How would we operate? It was for me, one of the motivations for starting the transition movement was that I had my kind of climate change dark night of the soul. And I read David Holmgren's book, which said, permaculture is the design tool for creating the society in response to this. And I felt so kind of like, right, this is when we storm the barricades. This is our moment. These things are coming together. Now is the time. And I can look round with the permaculture community around me at the time, who actually, most of whom seemed quite happy to be up a little farm somewhere, making chairs out of sticks. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so for me, transition was me trying to design a kind of Trojan horse that I could chuck permaculture in and Joanna Macy in and stuff like that. And I didn't have to spend hours explaining it with flip charts and pictures of chickens and arrows and orchards. I could just wheel it past and they'd go, oh, it's that transition thing. But I had all the other stuff in it and they could just wheel past with little squeaky wooden wheels and they'd go, oh, it's transition, And, so for me, the frustrations that I have with the permaculture movement is, why is it that after 40 whatever it is years of permaculture, maybe there is in Australia now, but there's not here. Why do we not have really professional design consultancies who are tendering for bids for big parks and who are tendering for the Olympics and who are tendering to do edible landscapes around business parks and who are upping the game to that extent, who are going to big football clubs and saying, can we grow hops all over the outside of the building? Can we, if this is a climate emergency, it's not enough just for us to say, all those people need to up their game. For me, there's something about saying we have to be creating the new businesses. We need to be thinking and working in the way that the people, when I spend time with entrepreneurs, their brain works in a completely different way. I talked about how permaculture rewired my brain. I spend time with people who are really brilliant entrepreneurs, and I think your brain is wired in a completely different way to mine. And that ability to think, okay, so we can start with this and then move that over there, and then we'll use that to do that, and then that's how we create the scale. For me now, the question is about scale. How do we scale this stuff? And the beautiful thing about imagination for me is that imagination flourishes when it has limits. If I said, tell me a story, you'd be like, if I said, okay, tell me a story about a mouse that lives under the table in a giant's house, you'd be like, okay, so here, or like Dr. Seuss writing a book with 50 words, or haikus or hip hop, where you have a form that inspires that creativity. For me, a climate emergency is totally that, and it gives us, and so for me, I think we need to be thinking about how do we embrace the possibilities of a climate emergency to completely scale up what we're talking about in permaculture. Permaculture should be completely mainstream, and it should be like every TV soap opera should have permaculture gardens and somebody who's in there. Where are the great transition storytellers, script writers who are writing those films and those stories? Where are the TV producers who've done the permaculture training. Do you know what I mean? It's like, for me, this is the time now where, there's an amazing, in London, there's guys who created, in Transition Town Crystal Palace, started a new food market. Amazing. And they've won all the best market in London awards, and it's fantastic. And I said to them, why do you do this? And they said, because we want our children to grow up thinking that this is normal. Yeah. And there's something for me about how we make this normal. And I think, and there are a lot of people within the kind of permaculture world who are really, and it's less like this than it was 10 years ago, but it's still, to a degree, that thing of wanting to change the world, but not really wanting to engage with the world. It's like wanting to sort of opt out of the world, but somehow get it to change at the same time. If you want to get the world to change, you have to roll your sleeves up. You have to speak their language. You have to wear a shirt sometimes and be able to speak in their language and put a tender together for a landscaping project and a construction project. And we need to have natural building companies who can tender for housing developments and who know where the clay is and who have teams of trained up professional clay plasterers who can come in. Do we need to scale this shit up really fast. And that requires a kind of and for me, the climate emergency thinking is the perfect kind of narrative to frame that around.
Well, with that, I have to say thank you so much. No, it's perfect, because it is. We do. We have the skills. We have this global network that communicates together, and having the motivation to, as you say, scale it up and really get it out is right where we need to be.
But that's totally in our hands. It's like, it's not in. We can no longer sit and say they need to do this, they need to do that. We've got all this stuff. We have to. I remember I interviewed Michael Schumann, who wrote all the Go Local stuff. And I said, what advice would you have for people? And he said, go to business school. In terms of, we need to be thinking in that kind of a way of making jobs for people. Because as long as we aren't creating livelihoods for people, then we're relying on volunteers. And if we're relying on volunteers, then it'll always remain a mostly white middle class movement. It's when we can start, like you see in Jackson and in Detroit and in Richmond, California, where people have got nothing and they're using permaculture and cooperative principles to rebuild the economy. That's what we need to be doing.
So I just met up with Davida Davison recently, who runs the Food Lab Detroit, and she was saying exactly that. All that vacant land, it shrunk from 2.5 million people down to 600,000 or 700,000, and all this vacant land, and only the poorest of the poor pretty much left. And how they're starting to turn that around with permaculture gardens and food enterprises. And it is about creating sustainable or regenerative livelihoods for people, not about just doing community gardens. And
absolutely,
I think it was where I was sort of starting to have a chat earlier about why in Kinsale did people spend 2 years doing that. It's that the livelihood at the end of things. And I think as a permaculture educator, there's a livelihood in that, but there's a livelihood so many different ways in doing permaculture, and I think embracing that sounds like where we need to go.
There's a woman called Daria Robinson in Richmond who runs a thing called Urban Tilth, who's one of my total heroes, teaching young people to become urban food growers in that place. And we did a talk together, and I talked about this and said, if we imagine we're going to do everything with volunteers, we're not going to get anywhere. She said, if this is a revolution that depends on volunteers, I can't be part of it, and nor can anyone where I live. People are working 6 days a week, 4 jobs to keep the roof over their heads. We can't be part of this if that's the idea.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you. So thanks for tuning in to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast today. It's been a real pleasure to have your company. I invite you to subscribe and receive notification of each new weekly episode with more wonderful stories, ideas, inspiration, and common sense for living and working regeneratively. And call positive permaculture thinking and design into action in this changing world. I'm including a transcript below and a link also to my 4-part permaculture series, really looking at what is permaculture and how to make it your livelihood too. So join me again in the next episode where we talk with another fascinating guest. I look forward to seeing you there.